My talk today, it's called a Mutualistic View of AI in the Library. I hope it's a message that resonates. Artificial intelligence is very much on everyone's mind in a different way recently. For some of us, it has been for quite some time. But of course, the contemporary discourse around it has rapidly changed, which sort of raises the question of, what is our role in particular with respect to AI? So I'm going to share some thoughts with you today that I hope resonate and that lead to a good conversation. So before I get started, a bit about sort of my perspective or where I'm coming from, what sort of informs my view on AI and cultural heritage. I'll share 3 different experiences, one of which that Sally just alluded to, so I may be retreading some ground that Sally already covered, so apologies for that. But for about the past 7 or 8 years, I've been working on a succession of different efforts funded by federal funding agencies in the United States or private foundations, also in the United States, that support the development of community around the question of how do we responsibly support the computational use of cultural heritage collections. It's been a series of projects. The first one was already computational collections as data, a little bit of a Heidegger thing going on there, if you catch that. That was funded by IMLS, and then following that project, we received funding from the Mellon Foundation to try and address the question of, how do we develop, provide access to, and sustainably support the use of collections as data at small, large, and medium-sized organizations. Recently, we held an international summit as sort of a concluding event to the most recent Collections as Data project in the US at Internet Archive Canada in Vancouver, Canada. What you see is a group of about 60 or so folks from 20 different countries, the Philippines, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, many Western European countries, Latin America, the United States, Canada, and so forth, to try and assess the state of collections as data practice in an international context. I won't try and speak to everything that was said at that event, but partially I don't need to, because we requested that everyone that attended the event should submit a position statement about collections as data in their particular national context, cultural context, the research communities that they engage with, and you can access those almost 200 pages of position statements on that wonderful open infrastructure that I appreciate so much, Zenodo. Another thing that informs sort of my perspective on this topic is some work that I concluded in December of 2019, right before the pandemic. So happy to release it, but also felt like it got kind of shut down like the rest of the world did during the pandemic. But I was a visiting researcher in residence at OCLC Research, primarily engaged in a community research project in the United States and Canada to assess what practitioners and disciplinary scholars were wanting with respect to artificial intelligence in libraries. And I chose the framing responsible operations after talking with Ruman Chaudhry, the former head of responsible AI at Twitter. This was a prior version of Twitter, a non-Elon Musk version of Twitter. She no longer works there, unfortunately. Should not be a surprise to many of us. But the responsible operations framing resonated in particular with the practitioners and scholars that I spoke to, because even at that time in 2019, there was the sense that in the GLAM community that we had become relatively fluent in the ethical pitfalls of artificial intelligence and cultural heritage, through the work of scholars like Sophia Noble and Algorithms of Repression. And really what there was a hunger for was, okay, we have a sense of what responsibility looks like, but we don't have as much of a sense of what responsibility looks like in our operational work. As we consider how to staff our organizations, as we consider how to develop training data, as we consider how to encourage different kinds of collaboration between our organizations where there are currently silos that unfortunately prohibit certain kinds of collaboration. So that's another piece of sort of cornerstone in my perspective. And then lastly, I've been at the Internet Archive for about a year now, and we have a gigantic mission I've worked at many academic, well, not about many, a few different academic libraries. I've worked at the Library of Congress. I've worked at a consortium of libraries, nationally. The Internet Archive's mission is very simple: universal access to all knowledge. Right? I just got goosebumps. Not to self-promote, but it's to me a very inspiring mission, and it's huge and it's daunting, and we have a ton of data. Depending upon who you talk to, it's almost 100 petabytes. It's likely significantly more than 100 petabytes of data. So institutionally, we're very interested in the potential of AI to help realize our mission, providing universal access to all knowledge. And we're actively experimenting internally across our organization with different kinds of artificial intelligence implementation right now. As a broader sort of community engagement, we also happen to be the host of the next AI for LAM conference. We'll be holding it at Internet Archive Canada in Vancouver, and the CFP will be coming out soonish, and would love to see some or many of you represented at that event in Canada. And so I'm here today to talk about a mutualistic view of AI in the library, or a continuation of craft. Aspects of a long-made AI promise suddenly seem possible in a way that they didn't 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. One of the challenges that we have is discerning which aspects of the promise of AI are real. Given the breathless marketing and news coverage that pervades our environments, it can be really challenging to feel like you're able to keep up, to feel grounded amidst all of the communication and updates that are, a flurry out there. This is a picture of a book that I have in my living room at my home in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I thought it actually kind of characterizes the feeling that many of us have trying to keep up with artificial intelligence, this keeping up with the times and sort of feeling like, wow, this feels like a really wild moment. I think that it really doesn't help as we're trying to make sense of what's possible, that a lot of the positions that we see in news coverage or on social media tend to be very black and white, very binary in nature. You're either sort of you're for AI, or you're against AI, and it's difficult to have any position in between. And I think that we should know better. For the librarians in the room, if you've ever facilitated any sort of search of a database, you understand, or researchers as well, the utility of Boolean operators. And somehow, as a series of societies around the world, we've tended to default to only using our not operator in thinking about the potential of AI. And we really need to be in a position where we are embracing the and the or. I believe that GLAM professionals should be able to cut through distraction around the potential of AI by being guided by a strong sense of our professional histories, and also just the fact that we know what our challenges are. We know what they are. They're long-standing, they're persistent, and they need to be resolved, right? So it's not like we don't know what needs to happen. When I think of distraction around artificial intelligence in terms of what is good, what is bad, et cetera, I started thinking about this typology, and to me, I see a few different things that are fairly common around communication around AI. It's kind of like this shock and awe sort of communication around the potential, where it's at the same time, everything is rainbows and it's going to solve everything. Look at this amazing technology. And then it's paired with this existential risk, like it's the realization of the Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator and the Skynet, and everything's going to explode. It's distracting, and I think not very effective. And then we have clueless, or if you're a Dungeons and Dragons fan, kind of like a chaotic neutral sort of communication of the potential of AI, where it's just all upside. It's all upside. There's no downside. Stop talking about downside. If you talk about downside, you're a doomer. You don't know anything. Let's just talk about the possible, right? And that's also kind of clueless and kind of stupid, to be honest. And then we have sort of avatar AI. This is where I think of sort of positions that try and sit above everything, almost like an omniscient kind of third-person view. And it's often the heads of very large corporations shielded by billions of dollars that take these kinds of positions. Again, not useful because they're not grounded in reality or everyday concerns or just the common questions that we have. Some things that I think that we could use to cut through these distractions to focus on what really matters to us. If I think about libraries in particular, I just think, as I've been saying, we know what our challenges are, right? We don't need to be like the tail wag the dog, that colloquialism around sort of, we don't need to be led by our nose by a technology. We know what our challenges are. We know that the challenges around fair data, for example. We know that many of our institutions have a troubled legacy and history of collection building that is tied to colonialism, imperialism, global disparities in capital, and slavery. And our organizations are working to deal with this actively. We know that many students, despite our best efforts, continue to feel quite intimidated by the physical space of a library and by the interaction of even our online spaces. And we know that, as always, the legal questions around how to conduct text and data mining in a multinational context are really challenging and continue to be so. As with anything, AI, we acquire tools for a certain purpose, and we refine our purpose as we experience the world through them. It's a sort of symbiotic relationship between human and tool, and we change just as our tools change. It's always been this way, or not to speak so absolutely, it's long been this way. If you think back to different media technologies over the past 150 years, from the phonograph to the photograph to the typewriter, each represents an inflection point in how humans have conceived of themselves, what is information, and what is possible. If we think about the typewriter in particular, toward the end of the 19th century, the hegemony of the printed word was shattered by the arrival of new media technologies that offered novel ways of communicating and storing data. The use of the typewriter changed the perception of writing from that of a unique expression of a literate individual to that of a sequence of naked material signifiers. This, if you're familiar with the work, is a direct quote from Friedrich Kittler's Gramophone, Film, and Typewriter, in which he adds a really helpful, I think particularly for the present moment, historical dimension to the extent to which we have been constituted by our technologies over time. And artificial intelligence is really no different. Of course, this is not a new story for GLAM organizations. If we were to think about, it's not really recent memory, if we're honest with ourselves, but the relatively recent memory of the increasingly ubiquitous access to the internet. This is a representation of how this happened in the United States in the beginning, but this was an occurrence of a technology that seemed like and was a substantial shift in the work of libraries and in the work of research, and we responded to it. In the United States, that's just one example. This is the place that I come from. By the mid-90s, there had been heavy federal investment in the creation of some of the first digital libraries in the United States. That sort of large-scale, resource-intensive effort to figure out what does a library mean online in terms of access to resources, in terms of research services, and so forth. Now, I don't want to characterize this necessarily as like every technology that we've interacted with, we've just known what to do and it's all gone great, because we know that it hasn't. One of the things that I'm trying to communicate here is that we had some of the early work funded by the government around the creation of digital libraries. And then along the way, a number of our GLAM organizations sort of fell prey to capital and began to resell and relicense collections that should otherwise be open to research, but are now bound into vended products that are resold the world over. We really don't want to repeat that in our interaction with AI to the extent that is possible. So that's also sort of a preface to 5 points that I want to share with you all today about the potential of AI and cultural heritage organizations and digital humanities research. Those 5 points being, this is our roadmap for the rest of the talk, augmenting and adapting GLAM services, realizing collection access and computational use for collections as data, centralizing and decentralizing effort, encouraging multi-sector collaboration, and the endless work of trying to determine what our real agency is relative to artificial intelligence. So on the topic of augmenting and adapting services, I often go back to a blog post that Trevor Owens, he's at the Library of Congress now, he wrote this, I think, in 2014. The title of the post was Mecha Archivists, Envisioning the Role of Software in the Future of Archives. And I think he made a fairly important point where he said, his vision for the future of the archivist using digital tools was less like the Star Trek Borg example and more like an exosuit, where the technology is primarily meant to extend the capabilities of the user, not to replace the user, not to make the user obsolete, but to be like a catalyst and a tool that could help make scalable the seasoned training, disciplinary background, and skills of what he says is the archivist in the machine. If we think about this idea of sort of augmentation, I would share with you all the example derived from my sense of academic library staffing patterns in the United States. My sense is that in the 90s, that most of the staffing investment was focused on trying to realize the opportunity of the web, version 1. Heavy investment in technical services staff to try and figure out how do we get all of these things that we have in our collections discoverable and findable and accessible, at least records of them, online. As we move into the 2000s, things are more online. But now the question is, how do we get other kinds of things online? And how do we support research with things online? And so we see, I think, increased investment in the initial development of institutional repositories, and also a re-envisioned notion of what public services staff can do or should do. And so I see that as sort of realize the opportunity of the web version 2. By the time we get to the 10s, things are online. Institutional repositories are sharing things. Public services have sort of changed. And then it kind of turns into what's an evolved sense of research services? Is there a role for us in research data management? Is there a role for us in digital humanities or digital scholarship in terms of what GLAMs can do to support this kind of work? I see this as sort of the initial supporting engagement with networked content and workflows on the web, version 1. Now in the 20s, 2023, with AI, I see a new ability to scale staff capabilities across different roles, technical services, digital library development, public services, and so forth. To me, this is the support engagement with networked content and workflows version 2. And as a primary example of that, or an example of that, I think about sort of how libraries tend to try and support computational research on a university campus. What I have seen is that libraries often maintain level of support at what I might characterize as like a tier 1. Introduction to Python, introduction to databases, introduction to data visualization, and so on and so on. And then in tier 3, if it's a larger universities, they may have access to high performance computing, and they usually have engineers that can support more advanced users. But between tier 1 and tier 3, there's this chasm. There's just a huge canyon of how do you get from just starting to doing sort of the parallel programming and the use of a cluster. It's like many of this person wearing this bunny suit with a skateboard, just kind of lost in the middle. Sometimes there's questions of should the departments do that? And oftentimes the departments are like, well, I don't really do methods. I do more sort of like introduction to the literature and original research, and grad students will just figure it out. Huge canyon. I think with the more widespread availability of large language model applications like ChatGPT, that there's an expanded role for the library that's more scalable, where perhaps we get from tier 1 to maybe tier 1.5, where we can start offering intermediate Python, advanced web scraping, intermediate visualization, and I think a next generation version of information literacy training. As the functional work of generating code becomes easier, say with something like ChatGPT, if you've ever used ChatGPT, who's used ChatGPT in the room? Can you raise your hand? Oh, okay, so maybe 65% of the room, I would guess. You could do things like say, can you write me a Python script that will support network analysis of web archives? And it will do it. And it works relatively well, which is kind of wild. But anyway, as the functional work of generating code like that becomes easier, I think it suggests a role for the library in investing more deeply in a long core area of work, fostering fundamental literacies in information, data, algorithms, and more. It's a fundamental equity-building role, especially for first-generation college students and those from minoritized or underrepresented backgrounds. It continues to be the case that adaptation to any environment and use of any tool is predicated on the knowledge of how to ask the right questions. Libraries have long played an important role here, and I believe that they will continue to do so. Point 2, realizing collection access and computational use, or collections as data. Backlogs, 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 backlogs. Many of our institutions are filled with these, filled with backlogs of materials that we can't provide access to. I would argue that they're like ghosts haunting us, all this stuff. I mean, we see it, it's a very material presence every day, and we're faced with the limitation in staffing and capability to provide access to these materials. The challenge becomes particularly pointed when we consider the cases where our organizations hold collections in languages that our staff do not have, right? So we have all these materials, say in, contextually, less commonly known languages, and we can't even make them discoverable because we can't catalog them. It's a primary violation of a maxim that was imparted to me by the late Jerry McDonough, digital preservation practitioner at the University of Illinois. Said, Thomas, there's no preservation without use. So we just have moldering, decaying collections within our care that we're not able to provide access to because we don't have the facility to describe them or the resources to describe them. Meanwhile, in industry, entities like Meta are developing AI-driven approaches to speech-to-text and text-to-speech for over 1,000 different world languages. There's an opportunity here, I believe, to resolve that no preservation without use tension for materials that are otherwise inaccessible due to linguistic limitations of collecting institutions. A challenge, figuring out how to draft behind or find a way to join efforts like Meta's to identify a solution to collection access for collections in less commonly known languages. Quote, less common, I know, a glaringly contextual, historically grounded state of affairs, as I mentioned previously, I believe is often a product of disparities in world capital and colonialism, imperialism, and so forth, right? Like, how did all these collections of X community end up at very large university in the United States? And now they're moldering on the shelves and no one can use them. I mean, it's a really small violin, I think. I think it's beholden that the universities use the resources that they have to provide access to these collections, and in the events where the communities that are represented in those collections do not want them to be accessible, that they honor that request. Collections as data, or long tail collections as data. This is a long tail distribution. Why is Tava showing us a long-tail distribution? It's going to become clear. I believe that current large language model focus is on the largest cultural heritage organizations or open knowledge efforts. Internet Archive, Library of Congress, Wikipedia. I mean, we know this to some extent. It's not completely transparent, but there is some documentation on what data are going into the various large language models that are backing things like ChatGPT. That's on the LLM front, and then just generally, apart from AI considerations, if we think about digital humanities researchers, again, the collections as data that tends to be available tends to be from the larger organizations. The potential large language model focus and collections as data engagement, I think a lot of the real promise lies in the engagement with the long tail in this distribution, are small and medium-sized organizations that have felt out of the conversation of how they could provide access to their collections. And if you compress this part of the graph, are of equal or larger size in aggregate collection holdings to the largest institutions. For the digital humanists in the room, questions of representativeness, I'm sure, keep you up at night. Or maybe they don't, and it just sort of like subtly stresses you out all the time. I think that in order to address that, we need to be thinking pretty expansively about access and inclusion and workflows that scale up and down to organizations of different sizes. There's an opportunity here for more representative data, and more representative data could lead to more representative LLM applications and their functionality, and richer research possibilities all around. I think a big challenge, variable international copyright landscape with respect to generative AI and fair use. For example, see the evolving differences between Japan, where they've decided that it's a national priority to say that every generative AI is a fair use regardless of copyright. Right? I gather quite different than how the conversation is developing in the EU. In the United States, it seems to be trending more in sort of the Japanese direction. I think it's particularly difficult to balance that sort of movement with the articulation of things like the Global Indigenous Data Alliance's CARE principles or documentation on Maori data sovereignty. It remains to be seen what agencies GLAMs have to steward the use of collections under their care across these dimensions of sort of community principles and national and international copyright with respect to generative AI and fair use determinations. Point 3, centralizing and decentralizing effort. We need some grand AI GLAM challenges. I know that AI for LAM has kind of gestured in this direction. I would love to see a more concentrated, widely participatory process to figure out what are our grand challenges in our community. How could we address them in a network manner? Could we coordinate between core and satellite activities to address these challenges? And if we're addressing them in an international context, can we think big? Can we think, I'm talking like International Space Station, stay with me. I'm thinking CERN, something of that nature. Why can they have this in space? Or why could they have this underground somewhere in a big loop, but we can't have it for libraries? I think we can. And that there should be tiered resourcing between core and satellite research activity. On the topic of centralization, this is the Large Hadron Collider and some future development, and then Chris Borg is not the Large Hadron Collider, if you're wondering. Chris Borg is in the corner. This is giving credit where credit is due. Chris is the director of libraries at MIT. Some years ago at a national forum in the United States, sort of kind of trying to, chart what could be next for libraries in terms of research and advancing the field. Chris brought up the point that, in the sciences, it's not uncommon that there are very large infrastructure investments in scientific instrumentation. Say, like the Large Hadron Collider, at a prior institution at Michigan State, we had a thing called the cyclotron. I don't know what it did, but it had a cool name. But basically she was making the point that in the sciences they have these large multinational investments in the development of infrastructure to address these grand challenges that I was just alluding to. And the nature of the challenges are so large and the investment is so significant that the instruments themselves almost create like a gravity well around them that necessitate further investment, maintenance of the infrastructure, recurring hiring of postdocs, fellows, staff. So it's like it has a gravitational pull in a global scale, pulling in people to try and address a shared challenge that the scientific community has recognized that they can't address individually within one region or within one country. And I believe that we need something similar for libraries, archives, museums, and galleries. But we can't cast aside the power of decentralization either. If we continue to extend the metaphor of the Large Hadron Collider, the scientists that come and visit and use that infrastructure, they come from their own centers and labs distributed around the world. There is a power in satellite activity as well as core activity. There are different constraints that we face in, say, different parts of the United States or different parts of Canada or Mexico. There are different community needs. There are different resources that satellites have. And I think that those constraints all lead to novel ways of resolving challenges. So this is a call for grand AI GLAM challenges. What are they? Could we address them in a networked manner? Is there a possibility of centralization and decentralization? I think that there could be. The big question is, how do we begin to fund this? We could explore leveraging existing collectives that have some demonstrated success at collective action, like the Big Ten in the United States, or DARIAH here in Europe, or Ivy Plus, or the HBCU Alliance, to pool a fixed percentage of budget multi-institutionally for ongoing investment in AI that advances the role of AI in supporting research and learning. This could be a variant of the David Lewis proposal from some years back. He proposed a 2.5% budget for allocation for collective investment in open infrastructure for scholarly communication. My sense is that it was arguably too late, that there had already been too much enclosure of content, services, and infrastructure by Elsevier, Springer, et cetera. I also think that the scaling wasn't quite right. I think that collective action is notoriously difficult. And so trying to propose sort of like a global collective action without first having progress within local, regional, national, or multinational consortia was not likely to be successful. But I do think that we could work within our existing collectives to explore this idea. I think that we can make progress forming these satellites and then eventually explore the ability to pool beyond existing collectives to a supra-international GLAM collective. Of course, engaging funders in government and industry. In the case of government, perhaps getting a common European data space. A little jealous of that in the United States. And industry to catalyze or augment all of the above. Point 4, multi-sector collaboration. Does anyone know why I'm bringing Kevin Bacon into this? Well, I really want to talk about Paul Erdos. I am curious, how do you say his name? Can someone say it out loud? Okay, thank you. I would try, but now I realize I really can't say it. But he is a quite famous Hungarian mathematician and wide collaborator. I think he's one of the most widely cited scholars of all time. I don't know if it was over 1,000 papers in his lifetime or something like that. But even in the present, you have scholars that in their Google Scholar profile will indicate an Urdush number. And that indicates their degrees of separation away from him in a larger social network of scholars. He's, I guess he's like the Kevin Bacon of scholarship, right? One of the things that I think is interesting about him is that his work, his pattern of sort of collaboration and publication, it illustrates a concept that was put forward in the 70s by Mark Granovetter called the strength of weak ties. And it was the idea that within a network of people that you get the most novel access to information, not through your strongest relations, but through a degree of separation away from your strongest connections. So if we think about the experience of Paul, he was constantly pushing past his strongest ties, and constantly trying to access new information, new ideas, new kinds of collaboration. And I think that we need to do the same thing, working in academia. These are just some sectors that come to mind. Government, higher education, and GLAMs, sometimes together. Industry, and some of the assets that they have. It has been my experience, at least, working in GLAMs, that when we think of industry, like this kind of thing happens. It's kind of like, they kind of like recede into a bush, and it's kind of like not often held to be a good thing to work with industry. I really think that this is kind of like head in the sand, particularly for very pragmatic reasons with respect to our work in artificial intelligence. Meredith Whittaker, the CEO of Signal, put out this article a couple of years ago called The Steep Cost of Capture, where she said modern AI is fundamentally dependent on corporate resources and business practices, and our increasing reliance on such AI cedes inordinate power over our lives and institutions to a handful of tech firms. It also gives these firms significant influence over both the direction of AI development and academic institutions wishing to research it. Going back, I don't know how we change that situation other than to find mission-aligned ways to collaborate with industry that are not like that are beneficial and are in line with our ethics and our responsibilities. I think that it behooves us to pay attention to and engage in challenges by entities like Mozilla, responsible AI challenges, efforts by entities like Hugging Face. Some of you in this room may be participating in this effort to try and bring together potential training data out of GLAM organizations, and also to be observant of and look for opportunities to collaborate with entities like Adobe, where when they're thinking about generative AI features for their products, that they are seeking to respect licenses and are exploring the idea of cost sharing with content creators. An opportunity here for mission-aligned, multi-sector collaboration that helps foster responsible terms of service and resolution of grand challenges. A challenge that we don't become party to our own enclosure yet again, like we did with our digital collections and our partnerships with Elsevier, et cetera, or our work with library LMSs, content management systems. That's going to be a tricky one. So the last point I want to make is about determining agency. So in very general terms, an agent is a being with the capacity to act, and agency denotes the exercise or manifestation of that capacity. One of the ways that we try and enact agency in our community is to create white papers or to create agendas that document community sensibility, community objectives, and so forth. As I mentioned earlier on, one of the things that I worked on was responsible operations. And I gave a talk on that agenda at the University of Edinburgh. And Melissa Terrace, at the conclusion of the talk, stood up and asked Thomas, you know, this agenda is so great, but what's your plan for advocacy? What's your plan for how you're going to work with local legislators? And then, you know, not to reuse the Homer gif too much, but this was me at Edinburgh. Because I'm a librarian. Like, I haven't thought about legislation or working with lawmakers or anything like that. So I was like, oh, shoot, good question. And then inside I was doing this Homer feeling, but then outside I think I maintained my composure. But anyway, it was something that stuck with me. And then I think following that, you know, I also recalled that Rye Dempsey, when he was still at OCLC, he did have sort of this, you know, Rye Dempsey-like comment in the track changes where he said, who or what orgs have particular agency to bring this work forward? He didn't have an answer for it, right? Or he didn't have an argument for who it should be. But as many of us know, sometimes questions are a kind of argument, right? And I think Lorcan was making a pretty forceful argument, and it took me a while to realize he was. So that's on me. But it does raise this question of when we're thinking about artificial intelligence and cultural heritage collections or digital humanities research, what is our role as a community or a set of communities in advocating for legislation, policy, and terms of service in things like, you know, ChatGPT or the generative AI product in Adobe? What role do we have with respect to legislation? How are we able to marshal our effort? Again, I'm thinking about the US, when our current presidential administration puts out a call for feedback on how they might consider advancing responsible AI research, development, and deployment. When I think about our mechanisms for collective action in GLAMs, library associations, archival associations, museum associations, I don't know that they're really doing much in this space at the moment, and we need them to. Apart from questions of legislation and policy, there's also the point of advocacy at terms of service for some of these products. These elephants in the room, AI, Google, Amazon Web Services, and so forth. It's clear that they can be influenced to some degree to change terms of service in their products. This headline being a reference to OpenAI sort of changing a practice around how they aim to make use of training data out of customer interactions with their product. To me, the question is what is our seat at the table? Do we even know what the table is? Are we able to be in the room where the table is? If we think about the long tail of organizations producing cultural heritage content day in and day out that become part of these large language models, how are they represented, if at all? If we think of, quote unquote, the biggies, are they represented, really? This is my attempt to create a segue to share a story about being at a conference, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, sitting around a table between conference sessions with senior library administrators in the United States. And there was kind of a burbling, hey, you know, what if we got a majority of all the largest libraries together in the United States? Could we collectively negotiate with Amazon Web Services to get better terms? To which someone with sort of not deeper knowledge of Amazon said, well, probably not. Did you know that not just libraries, but higher education as a sector is actually a loss leader for Amazon? Right? Collectively, we are still a very small planet relative to the ambition of some of these larger companies. And so the question then turns to, do we have other sort of advocacy mechanisms that have shown success, that are not necessarily large, but can pack a big punch? And of course, we have things like Creative Commons. And Creative Commons is doing work on artificial intelligence specifically, But the mission of Creative Commons is fairly tightly scoped, as it should be, to overcome legal obstacles to the sharing of knowledge and creativity. And of course, we all know that our objectives as a community are larger than sharing materials, right? We have research services. We're trying to educate students and support faculty and engage in our own research. Creative Commons is not enough. Love them, appreciate them, but we need more. We need to form bigger planets for our advocacy. We need to identify additional tables, and those tables need to be formed in advocacy communities that are combinations of different communities. For example, libraries in partnership with research communities, archives with public accountability communities like journalists, museums with civic development efforts. There's an opportunity to advance GLAM objectives through advocacy at the level of services, policy, and legislation, because these things are just forming. The challenge is the multi-community collective action. No biggie, easy, right? So this brings us pretty much to a close. These are the 5 points that I wanted to share with you today: augmenting and adapting services, realizing collection access and computational use, centralizing and decentralizing effort, multi-sector collaboration, the goal of determining our agency, deliberate action, ongoing community investment, and the advance of social equity. Let these be a continued grounding as we work to realize the potential of AI in the library. Thank you.